Hello, everyone. My name is Christina. I'm a third year student here at UC Berkeley, studying industrial engineering and operations research in the College of Engineering. Before we start off today's panel, I'm going to talk a little bit about me. I'm involved in College of Engineering organizations, Cal Spirit, and research on campus. So would like to thank all of our donors that might be watching because I, like many students on campus, am involved in a lot, and it really takes a lot of facilities, a lot of equipment to be able to do that. So thank you so much. Today's panel topic is Chronicling COVID-19, a collaboration between Berkeley Journalism and the New York Times. So to give you a brief overview, in April 2020, more than 80 students and nearly 20 journalism instructors and staff organized into small reporting teams to cover how the novel coronavirus is impacting each of California's 58 counties. The team stories are running in the main edition of the New York Times and its California Today newsletter and other top media outlets, including The Atlantic, NPR, LA Times, National Geographic, Cal Matters, Rolling Stone, and the Agesti Noticias in Mexico. Today, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist David Barstow will lead a conversation with two student reporters about their firsthand experiences in this unprecedented project. So a little bit about David Barstow. He's a head of investigative reporting at Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism. He is the first reporter to win 4 Pulitzer Prizes and the recipient of 3 Polk Awards, the Goldsmith Prize, the Alfred I. DuPont Silver Baton, the Bartlett and Steele Gold Medal, a Loeb Award, and really just an immense and incredible list of achievements and accomplishments. So you guys are really in for a treat today. Before I turn it over to David, I'd just like to remind everyone that you can submit questions by clicking the link in the lecture description at the bottom of your YouTube screen. So if you're in full view right now on your device for YouTube, minimize that screen, go to our description, and you'll be able to submit questions that way. With all that being said, please join me in welcoming David Barstow.
Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. It's an honor to be here with you on homecoming weekend. And it's also an honor to share this discussion with 2 of our star students from Berkeley Journalism, Daniel Lempres, give a wave, Daniel, and Katie Rausch. Daniel is a second-year student. He has been a research assistant working at the investigative reporting program on a number of really important projects that I can't tell you about because we're competitive journalists. And Katie Rausch actually graduated in the springtime, also has worked extensively at the investigative reporting program. And in fact, is working right now on a project for the investigative reporting program that we hope will be published before too long. She is just an astonishing talent, as is Daniel. Please, if there are editors out there in the audience, you must hire both of these great products of Berkeley journalism. I want to bring you back, if I can, to what feels like 10 years ago, but really was just March of this year, when we were kind of minding our business and doing our thing at Berkeley Journalism. Students were hard at work on their stories and going to classes, and then the shutdown happened in the middle of March, and it really had a profound impact, of course, on everyone, but also at Berkeley Journalism. It felt like a kind of 9/11 moment when, as journalists, our instinct, everything about the way we're built, urges us basically to run to the story and try to find a way to contribute to the public's understanding of this enormous public health crisis. And of course, the twin economic crisis that you could see immediately was going to be the dominant story for the year to come. And so I wanted to actually start by asking Katie and Daniel, who were students at that time, what it sort of felt like when the pandemic hit, and what it felt like in terms of like just put us in your shoes as students at that moment in time, and what you were thinking about and feeling, and how that then morphed into this this reporting project that we launched. Katie, do you want to lead away?
Yeah, I think, the first thing that comes to mind when I hear that question is I was just kind of, my head was all over the place, right? I didn't know what we were going to do, and we were so far along on other projects. And I think even David and I were having a conversation with a colleague of mine about a reporting trip we were going to take down to LA, and were we going to do that? And then this hit, and it was immediately, I knew that we were going to shift gears because we had to. I mean, like David said, as journalists, we feel very compelled to cover what's necessary. And it just didn't feel like what we were doing at that moment was as important as what we could do in trying to help people understand what was going on.
What did it feel like for you, Daniel?
Yeah, well, I would completely agree with what you folks said. So I think even amid kind of all the uncertainty, I think the one thing that we were all certain about was that we needed to get involved. We needed to do something. This was a moment that it was kind of immediately apparent was one for the record books. This was going to be one of the biggest stories of the decade, of longer, and we knew we had to get involved. We were just it was a question of how the J School would be supportive and how we could kind of best make use of our skills and our resources.
So this was a feeling that was palpable throughout the journalism school in the middle of March. And the way we responded as a school, I think is one of the great moments in the history of Berkeley journalism, because rather than just sort of resigning ourselves to being sort of stuck in Zoom land in classes, as an institution, as a school, we resolved basically to get in the game in a big way. In the span of a week's time, we pulled together 80 students and 20 faculty into a virtual newsroom that would cast a net over the entirety of the state of California, all 58 counties, with students assigned to each of those counties, broken up into small teams, each team led by a lecturer or a professor. And we were ready to jump in and start covering how the pandemic would hit. The question was, who would publish us and what would be the right platform for getting this journalism out into the world? And that's where a series of very happy coincidences enters the story. So the first happy coincidence is that before I came to Berkeley last year, I had spent 20 years at the New York Times. The second happy coincidence is that the executive editor of the New York Times, Dean Baquet, sits on the advisory board for Berkeley journalism. The next happy coincidence is that Julie Bloom, one of the national editors who's basically handled most of our stories, is herself a proud Cal alum. And the final happy coincidence is that Jill Cohen, who edits and produces California Today, the New York Times' newsletter covering the state of California, is also a Cal alum. So all of those happy coincidences made it kind of a no-brainer for us to form this partnership with the New York Times and begin actually digging in and covering this pandemic. Daniel, tell us, where were you assigned in the state of California? Who was on your team? And Katie, also, can you also tell us where you were assigned, who was on your team, and tell us what that sort of felt like in the initial days of this project?
So I was placed on a team with 3 other students working under IRP reporter Garrett Thorolf, who spent a decade at the Los Angeles Times covering local government, specifically the child welfare system. Los Angeles County has a massive and under-resourced child welfare system. And Garrett's experience kind of led him to believe that this was going to be a pivotal moment for child welfare, and a moment that it would really require some oversight. And so he and I and 3 other students kind of dove in on child welfare. We were specifically focused on Orange and Los Angeles counties, but we also did make contact with all 58 counties in California to see how the child welfare system was handling it. This was my first experience covering child welfare, so it was definitely interesting. It was an incredible learning opportunity to kind of learn while doing, learning how to cover the system, and especially at a moment like this.
Katie, where were you assigned? And tell us about that experience, at least in the beginning.
Yeah, so I was assigned to Santa Clara County, which was one of the hardest areas hit and the earliest areas hit, which we learned even, how early the virus had hit that area later on. But it was myself and a good friend of mine and colleague, Casey Smith. And we were working under the direction of Mark Shapiro, who's a lecturer at the journalism school. And so we were immediately trying to think about how we were going to cover Santa Clara County. It's just south in the Bay Area, and it already had quite a bit of media coverage from local organizations. But it was immediately thinking, okay, how are we going to add to that coverage, and what are we going to do differently, and how are we going to reach the audience of the New York Times?
So the two of you are pivoting in like a moment's time from full-time students, basically, going to classes, working on your assignments, to suddenly you're journalists. You're a working journalist, full-time working journalist, covering an area of the state as a beat. First of all, can I just ask, I know it was really difficult, but was it fun? What did that feel like?
I had a great time. I think for me, I don't have a ton of newsroom experience. And so this was a really incredible opportunity to work with the team, to collaborate. Every day started with our kind of team meeting, which was really nice and provided a great kind of rhythm for the day. And I learned so much about both public health, which is an area that I've never covered, and child welfare, another area I've never covered. And then also the kind of best ways to collaborate and work in teams, which we don't always do as much of in the J School, but this was a really incredible opportunity too.
Yeah, if I can just add, I think honestly, this was one of the best experiences that I had at the journalism school. And I say that knowing, how terrible the pandemic was, but for learning experience as a journalist, it was really something to be able to just be a journalist. And to be out there every day, waking up, making those calls, and really learning so much. I mean, we learned so much because we knew nothing. I had no context in Santa Clara County, and it was a county that was really difficult to communicate with. And so it was just immediately we had to find stories and find sources and learn how to do that. And so, yeah, I mean, it was certainly a great experience. And I'm so grateful that we had it.
Now, of course, like this is only journalists can sort of talk about covering the pandemic as being like enlivening and fun, but it's about how it makes your pulse race, right? And how it makes you as a journalist feel alive to stories and sensitive to suffering and aware of what actually is going on around you. And it's this feeling of being truly engaged in a profound and important way in the most important story of our time. So as I said, we put together this virtual newsroom. And I just want to give the people who are listening here a sense of what we actually ended up producing from this virtual newsroom. We've now published nearly 40 stories in the New York Times about various aspects of the pandemic. A very important set of stories covering a broad range of subjects and topics. We've had datelines from all over the state, from Tuolumne County to June Lake, to Santa Clara, to Oakland, to Palm Springs. We have produced very important stories about, for example, how Chinatown in San Francisco did actually a really amazing job at the outset of the pandemic in limiting the spread of COVID-19, contrary to some of the comments that have been made by our political leaders. That piece was in the New York Times. It also ended up becoming a NewsHour segment on PBS. We've had a team of 6 students who worked with Frontline on a story about how COVID has impacted migrant farm workers in California. We've had students who have written stories about Project Homekey, which is the much touted program in California for getting homeless people into housing during this pandemic. We've also had stories that have been discovered by our students that no one else has written about. So for example, it turns out that the pandemic actually really interfered with efforts to understand why whales are dying in large numbers off the coast of California. We also had a story recently about the fact that while there is a pandemic going on in the United States, there's actually a pandemic happening within the pandemic that is very important to the state of California, because it's a pandemic in our trout population in the state of California. A never before seen virus or disease is laying waste to much of the trout population, which of course matters enormously to those parts of the state that are really built around tourism and around fishing. So it's been a really huge array of stories that our students have produced for the New York Times. And at the same time, once people saw what our students were producing for the New York Times, of course, a whole bunch of other outlets came knocking and also wanted to work with Berkeley journalism students. And so in addition to the nearly 40 stories that we've produced for the New York Times, we've produced almost 35 more stories for these other publications that Christina mentioned at the outset. And of those stories, we're most proud of the fact that 3 of our stories landed on page 1 of the New York Times. And one of those stories was written by Katie Rausch. And another one of those stories, Daniel Lempres, was also a page 1 byline on the New York Times. So my first question to the two of you is, when you enrolled in Berkeley journalism, you envision the day would come when you would wake up and find yourself on page 1 of the New York Times?
I'll start. No way. No way did I imagine that was a possibility. I mean, that's a dream I think that a lot of us journalists have because of the New York Times, but I don't think I ever thought that would happen. And yeah, Daniel, I don't know if you feel the same way.
I feel the exact same way. I never thought in a million years this would happen, especially, as a first year J school student.
So Katie, tell us about the story that you wrote that ended up on page 1.
Yeah, so myself and Casey Smith, who is also recently graduated from journalism school, she and I wrote this story profiling kind of an enforcement officer. Her name was Angela Alvarado. She was actually a prosecutor for the Santa Clara County DA's office. And it started off as a story that was going to look at enforcement in general. And what I mean by enforcement was when the lockdown started, there were all of these rules about where people could be and what they could do and what stores could be open and things like that. And so we wanted to look at, how are they enforcing that? How are they going to make sure that, restaurants weren't open? And in Santa Clara County, they were doing it in a really unique way. They had dedicated a section of their prosecutor's office to enforcement. And essentially they were running a hotline where people would call in and complain and say, there's a barber shop running in someone's garage. This is unsafe, send somebody over. And in most other counties across the state, they had just left law enforcement to handle that. And so in addition to all the other emergency calls they were getting, they were also handling these new laws. And so Santa Clara County was really interesting in that they had this other team who was dedicated to not only interpreting the new laws, but then enforcing them.
So these are prosecutors. These are prosecutors who were before this happened, were prosecuting sex crimes and drug crimes and murders. And now they're enforcing the shutdown.
Exactly. These are people who are enforcing, who are prosecuting criminals, who are going out and, the Angela in particular, the one we profiled, she was making sure, that people were going to school. And she had spent, years as a prosecutor on sexual assault crimes. And now all of a sudden She's sitting at her dining room table with her kids in the background because they're home, and she's, fielding calls about, the different, churches trying to be open and things like that. So just a complete 180 of what she was doing with her life.
And Katie, how did you and Casey manage to get Angela, a prosecutor, to like open up and let you into her house to bear witness to this?
That was a really difficult thing, and I think that's been the difficult thing about reporting in a pandemic. Was we initially approached like a spokesperson for the DA's office and asked for some access, and then finally were negotiated over to Angela. But we had to make sure that we were going to take all the safety precautions with her because she had a family to protect. Gloves and masks and staying socially distant from her. And that was a challenge at first. I think we didn't even know if it was going to really happen, but eventually we got really comfortable. And I think a lot of the reporting actually happened over the phone in subsequent conversations.
So what was it that surprised you when you got into the story and you started getting to know this prosecutor? What was it that jumped out to you as surprising about her feelings and her approach to this very unusual task?
I think one of the things that surprised me, and maybe I should have expected it, but I didn't, but she was really having an internal struggle with enforcement. She was somebody who, believes in the Bill of Rights, believes in the right to freedom of speech and the right to bear arms and freedom of assembly. And now she's enforcing these rules that's basically violating those rights. And she admitted it. And you could hear over time, at first, when I spoke with her, I think it was early on in the pandemic, maybe a month or, maybe a little more in, but over time, then it was like, I'm sick of this. I'm done with this. This is so difficult for me to tell these businesses they can't operate. This is so difficult for me to tell these people that they can't go to Easter service.
So that was really, a very interesting thing that in one way was kind of a prelude to what we've now seen play out all over the country, really, is this sort of discomfort with all various restrictions on people's liberties, basic liberties, through this COVID crisis. Daniel, tell us about the story of yours that ended up on page one. I think you've referred to it a little bit already, but give us a little bit more insight into both that story and tell us a little bit about the role that you played in helping us actually tell that story.
No problem. As I mentioned, I was put on a team that was focusing on the child welfare services around the state of California. Early on, we were immediately concerned that the closing of schools could have fatal side effects. Teachers are mandated reporters, which means they have to call child welfare services if they suspect abuse or neglect is happening. And so kind of conservatively, about a quarter of calls come from teachers. And so we were immediately concerned these kids weren't going to be seen by professionals. They were just going to be at home, and not only at home, but at home at a really, really stressful time. One of our first steps was just reaching out to these various agencies and finding out what sort of guidance they were giving to their social workers. We were trying to figure out how child abuse investigations were happening, whether they were happening in person, and whether these side effects that we were worried about were actually coming to pass.
So the concern is that how are children who are at risk of neglect and abuse, how are they going to be protected by our child welfare agencies in the midst of this pandemic?
Correct. Yeah. So
question, right?
That was the question. Yeah. It was how are these agencies going to both keep their social workers safe while not neglecting the children of California? And
that's a tough story to get at.
It certainly is. Yeah. Anything surrounding child welfare, the records can be really hard to come by. These systems, not many people understand how they work, and there's not much oversight. And especially at a moment like this, where the agencies have kind of a ready excuse for delaying interviews, delaying records requests, it's really a challenging story to get at. The way we were finally able to get in was that there are these disclosure requirements within the state welfare and institutions code that requires certain information to be provided when a child fatality occurs. And so what we did was we reached out to all 58 counties in California, asking about child fatalities in the last couple of months while the pandemic was happening. And that's how we found the story of Aiden Braden, who was the kind of featured character in the story that ran in the New York Times.
Tell us about that case.
Yeah, so Aiden and his twin brother were born in the end of February. They were 2 days old when CPS, Child Protective Services, received the first call alleging abuse and neglect for them. CPS went out, they spoke to the twins' mother, who acknowledged that her drug addiction kind of lasted well into her pregnancy. Records reflect that her 3 previous children had all been taken by CPS for similar problems in years past. And so, within 2 days of these children being born, the system is made aware that they are in peril. And then over the next 38 days, Fresno County Child Protective Services made a couple of calls. They didn't ever really connect with the mother face to face. And 38 days after that first call, when his mother woke up, Aiden was dead.
So we have an infant child being cared for by a mom with a well-documented addiction to drugs, whose 3 older children were all removed for abuse and neglect, with calls coming in 2 days after the birth of her 2 twin boys, saying that she's neglecting them. The state knew about this within 2 days, took no meaningful action for the next 38 days until suddenly they discovered and learned about the death of little Aiden. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes. And then after Aiden died, they did finally connect with the mother and had her take a drug test, which she failed. And so they took Aiden's twin brother away from her as well. And we spoke to the woman in charge of Child Protective Services in Fresno County, who said that at the time her workforce was down by about 1/3 because people were on leave to take care of their own children and for other reasons related to the pandemic.
So she was acknowledging basically that the pandemic itself had interfered with their ability to protect this little child.
It did.
And you actually went out and did interviews with people who had encounters with this mother and her 2 infant babies. Is that correct?
It is, yes. So we went to Toll House, California, which is a kind of a foothill community near Fresno, to the address that was on file in the CPS databases to see what we could find out.
This is you and Garrett?
This is me and Garrett, the team lead, and we connected with some people who knew the mother, and we were able to get some more information about what she was like, what her life was like, and also what that crucial 40-day period was like.
And so, but you also learned that what you had seen in this particular case in Toll House, you were also hearing that it was happening in other forms and in other ways throughout the state of California. Is that correct?
It is, yeah. So what happened in Toll House is indicative of what happened around the state. There were a lot of changes that were made to protect social workers and theoretically protect foster families and other folks involved in the system. Some of these changes included statutory deadlines were changed, giving social workers more time to respond to reports of abuse and neglect. Social workers were allowed to do these investigations over the phone in some situations, which experts say is very ineffective. You can't really do a child abuse investigation over the phone successfully. And we found out that emergency response social workers were not being prioritized to receive protective equipment in the same way that other first responders like police officers, firefighters, and EMTs were, despite the fact that they are also emergency response workers who need to go out at a moment's notice to do their job.
And by the way, Daniel, I know you would want to mention this, right? That you actually had some great help from a number of other students who worked on this. Can you just quickly tell us about them and how you guys organized yourself as a team to bring this very important story to the public?
Yeah, absolutely. It was definitely a team effort. So there were 4 students on the story. It was me and 3 students who have now graduated. Ricky Rodas, Exal, and third one was Laurence Dussault. And we basically we divided the state up, and we in order to make these calls, in order to get in touch with all 58 of these county agencies, we also had to get in touch with the state agency, and there was also some guidance coming from the federal government. So a lot of moving pieces, a lot of different systems to understand. We also did some kind of exploratory research in other states to see if California was an outlier or if this was truly a nationwide problem.
So what I'd like to share is I was having conversations with the New York Times about both of these stories, Katie's story and Daniel's story. And the reason why Daniel's story was put on the front page of the New York Times is because despite there having been obviously an absolute gusher of news coverage about the pandemic and all of the facets of the pandemic, no journalist up until that point had actually identified this particular problem with child welfare agencies during the pandemic. And it was what we described in this story. We focused especially on California, but it was also something that we knew and could see and described was similar things were happening around the country itself. In other words, while we were all getting used to the stories about emergency room nurses and firefighters and police officers all sort of kind of leaning in and quite heroically working with patients and getting people to hospitals and getting people help, with the child welfare agencies, we were seeing something slightly different. We were seeing more of a retreat from children who are at risk, and the ability to actually describe that and show that, that's what put that story on page 1 of the New York Times. And in Katie's story that she worked on with Casey Smith, and by the way, we should note that both of these stories had photographs that were taken by Berkeley journalism students as well. We've done that with all of our stories. The photographs by almost in every single case have been taken by Berkeley journalism students. In their case, the fact that Katie and Casey were able to get a prosecutor to speak so frankly about her ambivalence about enforcing these new laws and new regulations around the shutdown, that too was something that, for all of the coverage that had been done, much of it on, by the New York Times itself, no journalist had yet actually delivered that story. And so that also is the reason why that story made it onto page 1 of the New York Times. And I think it's an enormous testament to Katie and to Daniel and to the other students who have been involved in this coverage, that they have consistently identified and come up with stories, even as journalism students, that all of the other professional journalists out there have yet to actually identify and deliver. And I think that's one of the things that has been most distinctive about this project, is that our students are consistently seeing stories that no one else is covering and no one else has seen yet, and they're delivering them to the public and helping the public understand different facets of this pandemic. I have to ask both of you, first, what was it like to wake up the morning that your story was on page 1? Just take me through what that felt like, and more importantly, maybe most importantly, how has that affected your hunger to do this kind of work for into the future? Katie.
Yeah, so definitely waking up in the morning and looking and seeing the story online. And I think, Casey sent me a link right away, and my mother was texting me and trying to figure out where she was going to find a copy of a New York Times in northern Minnesota in the pandemic. And then I ran out and tried to buy as many copies and got a very strange look from the man at Walgreens who was wondering why I was buying 5 copies of the New York Times. But, it was a really surreal experience to know that I was reaching so many people, not just from the paper copy, but from the online version of the story. And it really just, I have a friend who read the article and didn't even realize that I had written it. And, had later said, oh, I read this article. And I was like, oh, I wrote that. So, it really shows the reach you can have when you have access to something like the New York Times, when you have, somebody like, I can't help but sing your praises, David, because, when you have somebody like you who can connect us with those outlets to get those stories out there, that's huge. And I think that makes us really excited to keep doing this and to keep pushing our stories out there so we can reach those large audiences that the New York Times reaches.
Daniel, what was it like for you?
So I took the first week of August off and was doing a little bit of camping. So I come out of the woods one morning pretty much, and my phone immediately lights up as soon as I get into phone service with a million text messages. And just like Katie's mom, my next step was running around this kind of agrarian area looking for a copy of today's paper. I was able to find 2, luckily. And it was, just the outpouring of support, and just the number of people that reached out on social media just to say how glad they are that we were looking at child welfare, how impactful they found the story. It really kind of crystallized what for many months felt kind of like almost ethereal, because it was just, you're sitting alone in your room. It doesn't really feel, you're making progress, but it doesn't always feel like that with investigative reporting. Sometimes it feels like you're just kind of spinning your wheels. And so to wake up one morning and to see that product out in the world was really incredible. And it really kind of validated being here and wanting to do this kind of work. It's so important. It can reach so many people. And we're really lucky at the IRP to have so much support. And also we have like special funding for child welfare reporting, which has been hugely, hugely important and has really helped us to really dig in on child welfare in a number of different areas. There's much more to come.
By the way, just a quick note, shout out to people who are able to connect with us. Please, I encourage you to send in any questions that you might have. We're happy to take them as they come. I know we had a few technical glitches at the outset, but if you're with us and you have questions, please send them in on that link that I know exists on your YouTube page. The other thing I wanted to also mention is, like Christina, I would say I want to make a special thanks to our donors, because actually, as it turns out, our donors really helped make this project that we're talking about today possible. Because to pull this off, we need to have money in order to send Daniel Lempres to Toll House to track down the people who actually know something about the tragic death of this infant baby boy. We need money to help Katie go to Santa Clara and spend time with this prosecutor, to purchase records, government records, official records, data. All of that doesn't happen without the incredible support of our alumni network and our fabulous donors. So I just wanted to say a quick word of deep gratitude and thanks to the folks who have helped make this project possible. I wanted to come back to Katie and to Daniel and really ask a little bit more. I wonder if you could share with our audience here, tell us something very specific that you actually learned about doing journalism through this particular project. something that you either learned about reporting, or something that you learned about writing and storytelling or fact checking. Take people into some of the key lessons that you absorbed from being part of this process. Daniel, do you want to lead us away?
Yeah, sure. So I think the most kind of significant or impactful thing was that with investigative reporting in our class, in our coursework, David talks a lot about like you have a hypothesis. So you study the system and you come up with a hypothesis, like maybe this is going wrong. And so in this case, it was, what is it going to mean that these child abuse investigations are not happening in person? This could lead to child fatalities. And so that was the hypothesis. And then it immediately became about, how do we vet that? How do we confirm that? What's the kind of most painless way to figure out whether or not that is actually happening? And so for me, it took these kind of lectures that we had been having in these classroom setting, and it really kind of, we hit the ground and we did the legwork. We did the investigative reporting legwork, and we were able to just kind of really dig in on our hypothesis. And it was really helpful because it all feels, it's great whenever coursework can actually, comes in and applies in a setting like this.
Katie, what about you?
Yeah, I would say it's probably two things. First of all, I would say one of the biggest things that I learned was how to find a story that was going to reach a national audience. I had worked in local newsrooms before, and I knew how to cover, the basics and write those stories about how many cases there were that day and, how many hospital beds were free and things like that. But to be able to kind of, stretch your mind and say, what story would be significant to a national audience and how would we tell that? That was a really huge skill that I had never learned before. And frankly, I don't think I would have learned without the project. I think the other thing that I learned that was really important was finding the story within the story. And what I mean by that was, I think Casey and I set out kind of thinking that we were going to do a story about enforcement, and it would look like, we would show people the cops going out to a scene of a business and shutting it down or something like that. And really, that wasn't necessarily the story at all. It was this story about this internal struggle that this prosecutor was having that was really emblematic of what a lot of people were going through trying to enforce these rules. So I think that was another really great lesson, to learn to know how to abandon maybe what your original thought was based on the reporting that you eventually do.
We have two questions that have come in from the audience. The first actually is for Daniel. Daniel, are you interested in continuing to report on public health or child welfare stories because of the experience you've just had?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think almost every day about how grateful I am to have learned such an important and kind of undercovered beat. There are not very many reporters out there who know the ins and outs of the child welfare system. Garrett Thorolf, who I worked with at the IRP, is one of the best. And so learning from him about this system that is so important, but that gets so little oversight was incredibly important. And some of the stories I'm working on right now actually come out of that base of knowledge. And so I do hope to continue covering child welfare and hopefully, trying to highlight ways the system could be better. I think that's definitely something I'm interested in continuing to do.
And here's a question for both of you. How do you think this experience will inform or advance your careers? Katie, why don't you jump at that?
Well, I hate to state the obvious, but having a story published in the New York Times is definitely a good thing to put on your resume. So I definitely think that is helpful. But beyond that, the experience of going through identifying a story, understanding what kind of a story will resonate with people, and then putting that story together in a compelling way, I think that experience will forever inform the way that I try to tell stories in the future.
And now there's a question for me, which is, will the partnership with the New York Times continue and possibly broaden beyond the pandemic? And I'm happy to say the answer to that question is yes. And in fact, it's already begun to broaden. So we continued this reporting through the summer. Again, thanks to some very generous support from donors. we were able to bring aboard students as interns over the course of the summer. And of course, as the summer went on, the pandemic story was also joined by another really huge and important story, which was the story of the racial reckoning brought about by the death and the murder of the killing of George Floyd. And so our students actually who've been working on this this partnership with the New York Times have actually started to began this summer shifting coverage to try to identify stories that also dealt with the question of systemic racism and race relations in this country. And so we actually have been continuing to identify those stories. I actually have a story that when I get done with this, I'm going to be spending the afternoon editing that we'll be pitching to the New York Times, and hopefully it'll be running in the coming days. That's very much about the way the racial reckoning is being felt in California. And on top of that, we've now begun to pivot our attention because of a very important event that's rapidly approaching, which is Election Day. And so we have encouraged our students to begin identifying and looking for stories about the election and how the election is being felt in California. And we, in addition to our partnership with the New York Times, we've also formed a partnership with Cal Matters, which is a very important news outlet in California. It's really hugely influential, especially on California politics and California public policy. And it's for those of you who don't know it, I encourage you to go to the Cal Matters website and look at their amazing work. And our students, so we have a partnership with Cal Matters, we have a partnership with the New York Times, we also have a partnership with KQED, which is really the biggest public radio station in Northern California. And all of our students, we're encouraging all of our students to produce election coverage around for all three of those partnerships. And one of our special areas of focus, especially with our Cal Matters partnership, is really on stories that are examining basically the integrity of this election. And all of the issues that are around the basic mechanism of putting on a fair and free election. So for those of you who are in California, you know that one of the big stories last week was the discovery of these ballot boxes that were placed around the state, and in some cases were labeled official ballot boxes. And it turned out that they actually weren't official ballot boxes. They were ballot boxes that the Republican Party has placed in different parts of the state in order to try to encourage people to drop their ballots off, and then the GOP would then deliver those ballots. We're forming a team of students to work on stories with Cal Matters, really focusing on all of the aspects about the kind of just the basic integrity of this coming election. So yes, we're definitely moving forward. We have a question, which is, how do you balance the need to have compelling visuals for your work when sometimes there isn't a moving visual? That's a great question. That's a question that comes up all the time in journalism. I mean, we know that great art is very important to helping people get connected to a story. I wonder if I actually want to show you, I'm going to try to share my screen and show you one of the photographs that our students took that I think is one of the best photographs I've seen in the entire pandemic coverage. All right, so I want to show you, by the way, this is the website at the Berkeley Journalism School where you can actually see all of the stories that have been produced through this reporting partnership. And I encourage you to go to the Berkeley Journalism website. You can look at every single one of these stories and see the kind of work that our amazing students are producing. But I want to zero in on this image if I can. This image here, let me describe what this is an image of. So this is a homeless encampment in Oakland. And these are some folks in the early stages of the pandemic who were, one of the big questions was, how are we going to know if COVID is spreading like wildfire through densely packed homeless encampments that don't have access to the hygiene and the all of the other things that we would take for granted. And one of our students was assigned to this story and actually took this image here, which was published, by the way, in the New York Times, about an effort that was happening right here in our backyard to actually get homeless people tested for COVID-19. This is one of the early efforts to actually do something about this. And we were there to document it. And when I saw this image, I thought, wow, you know, I've worked with great photographers. I've been blessed to work with really great photographers in my career. And I thought, you know what, this image here is as good as any that I've ever encountered in the stories that I've worked on with the photographers who I've worked with. And it was a great example, I thought, of the kind of visual work that our students are doing as part of this effort. And I should mention, by the way, there's one other thing I wanted to mention. We've had a number of our students who've actually been working with the data desk at the New York Times. The data desk at the New York Times is a really important part of that newspaper's coverage of everything. It produces all of the graphics and all of the charts, and it produced, among other things, this iconic front page. Many of you might remember this. This appeared on the front page of the New York Times on Sunday, May 24th. And there were no stories on this front page. There were no photographs on this front page. All that existed on this front page was a listing of some of the people who had lost their lives right as we passed that first awful 100,000 threshold of victims of COVID in this country. And one of the things that I am really proud of is that 3 Berkeley journalism students were part of the team that produced this front page, which I think will go down in the history of the New York Times, the 150 plus year history of the New York Times, as one of the iconic page 1 images ever. And our students, all 3 of them Berkeley journalism students, students with a special focus on data journalism, helped produce this. And so this is another great example of how Berkeley journalism students were not just producing stories, or were involved in data journalism. As you saw from the front line, we also have an amazing documentary program. We have students who love telling stories in documentary form. And through our partnership with KQED, we also have students who love telling stories for the ear. And all of those skill sets have come to bear in these partnerships.
There was one last question, and we are running out of time. But the last question, I think you somewhat answered. It was about, do the reporters work closely with the staff doing data visualization work for charts, graphs, maps, et cetera? And are they asked to gather that data to hand it off to them?
Well, I think we just we just answered that.
Right.
And so it's really been, you know, this moment, this crisis, the enormity of the pandemic, followed by obviously the enormity of the racial reckoning story, and now the enormity and the importance of this election coverage, I think, have all been part, I think, of a larger pivot within the journalism school to encourage our students to actually do journalism, and do journalism that helps the public understand these giant stories and make sense of them and figure out what they mean and how they're impacting communities, especially communities that are often overlooked and ignored in much of the coverage that we see day in and day out. I'm told that we need to wrap up. I guess I see, I'm sorry, there's one more quick question. Do we have time to answer this last question? The question is, with so many news outlets out there, how do we reach people who sometimes find Fox News is easier to understand and relate to, even when facts do not necessarily align well? There are so many social issues to address that somehow get pushed aside. It sometimes feels big businesses and politics play too huge a part. Was it easier when there were only 3 larger TV networks to get our news from? Okay, so we're clearly not going to be able to address all of that in the time we have left. That's a huge question, but it's also a profound question. And it's one of the questions that we focus on constantly at Berkeley Journalism. And that's the question of, we know how polarized this country is. We know that there are people who are being told not to believe anything if it doesn't come out from their favored source of news. And what we focus on in terms of trying to combat that is we focus on executing a kind of journalism that is really transparent in where we're getting our information from, that is scrupulously focused on facts and fact checking. It's very focused on attribution, getting records, getting sources on the record, getting people to talk and put their names behind things, showing source documents when that's appropriate as part of the story so people can kind of judge for themselves. It's I think the thing that we probably focus on as much as anything else is this question of how do we execute a kind of journalism that whatever else you think, you don't have to wonder, is this fake news? Would you agree with that, Daniel and Katie?
Absolutely. You make us check every single word, and now that's what we do from now on out.
How painful was the fact-checking process?
Painful.
Well, it was a lot.
Well, with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us. I'm sorry about the technical glitches that we had in the outset, but it was a real honor for us to be able to spend some time with you. And I thank you so much for spending time with us. And I think with that, we'll call this a wrap.